You're listening to the Michelangelo Signorile Show on Sirius XM.
Welcome back. I'm Michelangelo Signorile on Sirius XM Progress 127. I was telling you all about Johann Hari's book, Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. It is both a history of what we call the war on drugs, as well as a look at addiction, a look at drugs, a look at what drugs are, a look at what addiction is, and really what he comes to tell you is that it's not anything that you thought. 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States, over 40 years since President Nixon called drug abuse public enemy number one. We've had this so-called war on drugs ever since, and we've not dealt with the problem of addiction in our society, and we have a lot of people in jail, and we criminalize drug addiction when we should be helping people deal with a problem, but we don't even really have an idea of the problem. At least that is what Johann Hari tells me, and in this book, and he's in the studio to talk to us about it. Welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So talk a little bit about what motivated you. You were a columnist, and I should have said you're a British journalist. You were a columnist at The Independent for 9 years. You also really distinguished. You were twice named Newspaper Journalist of the Year by Amnesty International. You were awarded the Comment Award for Cultural Commentator of the Year by the Editorial Intelligence. You were named Journalist of the Year by Stonewall, the gay rights group in Britain. You really were, this was kind of you looking at people in your own life.
Yeah, I realised a little bit less than 4 years ago that we were coming up to the centenary of it being 100 years since drugs were first banned. And I had a very personal reason to want to look into this. One of my earliest memories was of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And as I got older, realising there was drug addiction in my family. And I think like a lot of people with that background, I was very drawn to relationships with people who were drug addicts. And I realised that there were just loads of really basic questions about this area that I just didn't know the answer to, and I couldn't find anywhere. Questions like, why were drugs banned in the first place? Why do we continue with a war on drugs approach when it doesn't seem to be working? What are the alternatives to a war on drugs? And what really causes drug use and drug addiction? So as you say, I set out on a quite epic kind of journey. I ended up crossing 30,000 miles and 8 different countries. And really part of the problem I thought was that we discussed this in such an abstract way. I wanted to look at this about how it affects real people on the ground. So I just spent a lot of time with a lot of different people, from a transsexual crack dealer here in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to an amazing person.
I want to get into all of those stories.
But from just a really big range of people.
You were talking about how, though, you were dealing with a boyfriend who was dealing with addiction, then you were taking these narcolepsy drugs.
I had my boyfriend had a heroin and crack problem, and I was taking a significantly less problematic, but a drug called Provigil, which a lot of people will have heard about. It's marketed. Well, no, it's not marketed. It's effectively used as a smart drug. It was discovered in narcolepsy trials that if you take them and you're not narcoleptic, it just makes you able to concentrate longer and be smarter, really. And I think because I was quite...
When you say be smarter, I mean...
Well... I was a bit of a workaholic, and I wanted to be able to...
So you just stay up all night and write?
Exactly, and be able to focus and read. And I remember when I first took it, reading A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking in one sitting, thinking like, I don't remember a damn word of it now, but it seemed to make sense at the time. But, but obviously one of the drawbacks if you take a narcolepsy drug is you don't sleep, and that's problematic for all sorts of reasons. So, I think there were all sorts of factors that were going into why I wanted to understand. And what really struck me on this journey is, a huge number of things, but it really struck me that almost everything we think we know about this subject is wrong. Drugs are not what we think they are. The drug war is not what we've been told it is. Drug addiction is certainly not what we think it is. And the alternatives are not what we've been told they are. So It's really amazing to be...
I want to get at all of those things, because those are all such interesting things you said. Before we get to the drug war and the history of it, when you say drugs aren't what we think they are, what are they?
Well, I think it's a very big question. I would relate it to how we think about addiction. So if you had said to me 4 years ago, what causes heroin addiction? I would have looked at you like you were a little bit stupid, and I would have said, well, heroin causes heroin addiction. And for 100 years, we've been told a story that seems to us so obvious that it's like our common sense. We just take it for granted, right? We think that you, me, I'm trying to think how many people there would be in our immediate vicinity, 20 people near this studio, right? If you, me, and these 20 people, if we all use heroin for 20 days, on day 21, we would all physically need heroin. There are chemical hooks in heroin that our body would then physically crave. That's what we think addiction is. The first thing that alerted me to the fact this story may not be right was a doctor in Vancouver called Gabor Mate, an incredible man, who explained to me, if you get run over and you break your hip, right, God forbid, you'll be taken to hospital. You'll be given a huge amount of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's much better heroin than you would score on the streets because it's medically pure. You'll be given it for quite a long period of time. That's happening all over this city, every city anyone's listening to this in, everywhere in the developed world. People are being given heroin in hospital for long periods of time. Now, if what we think about addiction is right, what should happen? Those people should leave hospital and want to score on the streets. They should leave as addicts. People will have noticed their grandmother was not made into a junkie by her hip operation. And when I learned that, I kind of didn't really know what to do with this information. And then I met Bruce Alexander, a professor in Vancouver, who explained to me an amazing story. And I think he's an extraordinary scientist, an extraordinary person. He explained to me this old theory about addiction that we have comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Anyone listening to this, if they're feeling a little bit sadistic, could do it themselves. You get a rat and you put it in a cage. And the rat has two water bottles. One is just water and one is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and will almost always kill itself. So there you go. That's our theory of addiction. But in the 70s, Bruce comes along and says, well, hang on a minute. We're putting the rats in an empty cage. They've got nothing to do except drink this drugged water. Let's try this differently. So Bruce built Rat Park, which is like heaven for rats. They've got loads of friends to have sex with. They've got loads of nice food. They've got loads of coloured balls. They've got everything a rat could want. And in Rat Park, they've also got both the water bottles, the drugged water and the normal water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, the rats don't like the drugged water. They drink hardly any of it. They never overdose. They never use in a way that looks like addiction or compulsion. There's a really interesting human example of this that I can give you in a minute. But what Bruce said is this tells us that both the right-wing theory of addiction and the left-wing theory of addiction are wrong. The right-wing theory is it's a kind of moral failing. You're a hedonist. You party too hard. The left-wing theory is, it's a brain disease or it takes you over. It hijacks you. What Bruce says is neither of those things. It's not your morality. It's not your brain. It's your cage. Addiction is an adaptation to your environment. And that forces us to think about addiction in a whole different way. It tells us something really profound about our culture. There's a really interesting human example of this that happened, interestingly, at the same time as Rat Park. It's called the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, about 20% of American troops were using heroin regularly. And if you look at the news stories from the time, there's real panic. They thought, my God, we're going to have, hundreds of thousands of heroin addicts on the streets of the United States. Actually, all the evidence is they came home and they just stopped, the overwhelming majority. Because if you're taken out of a hellish pestilential jungle where you think you might be killed at any moment you don't want to be, and you come back to your nice life in Wichita, Kansas with your friends and your family, it's the equivalent of moving from that first cage to the second cage. And this has massive implications for the war on drugs. Obviously, if the war on drugs is built on the idea that, it's the chemicals that cause the addiction, therefore we need to physically eradicate the chemicals. If in fact being cut off and being isolated is what causes the problem, we should be dealing with that. But also it has huge implications, I think, deeper kind of implications for the whole way we live. We live in a society, we've created a society and culture where huge numbers of our fellow citizens don't want to be present in their lives. They're so disconnected. They're so cut off. Bruce talks a lot about how in addiction we talk a lot about individual recovery, and that has value, but we need to think much more about social recovery. Something has gone wrong with us as a group and as a society, not just as individuals.
So getting back to what you were saying about if you're in the hospital and you're getting this painkiller, it's really heroin. There are so many people who get addicted to prescription drugs, and then they sometimes go on. We've seen this problem here on Staten Island. The way it's been described has been people started out on prescription drugs, and they couldn't get their prescriptions anymore, and then they wound up on heroin. I guess you would say, well, but there are others who get these prescription drugs, and and they don't get addicted.
I would say much more than that. I think you're right. That's part of it, but I think there's a much bigger and more complex picture there. Firstly, why have we seen a huge rise in prescription drug addiction in the years since 2008? Something else has happened since 2008. It's the collapse of the middle class, a massive rise in insecurity, a massive rise in people feeling terribly anxious, cut off, depressed. They're medicating themselves for the deeper social problems that we have. That's certainly the case. I would also say, if you look at when do the biggest problems now that's a problem in itself. If people are anxious and having to medicate themselves, that's a tragedy, and we need to deal with that. When do the worst problems happen? They happen not when the person is prescribed oxy, but when they are cut off from being given oxy. That's really important.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Switzerland, I went to Switzerland where they've effectively legalized heroin for addicts. If you're an addict, you go to a clinic, you're given your heroin every morning, you can inject it, you can't take it home with you. And the problems of those heroin addicts massively stabilise. They don't have a constant scramble to get the money for street use. Most of them choose to reduce their dose over time because their lives stabilise, they get better. What we do in America is the exact opposite. We cut people off the moment we know they're addicted. That, of course, forces them out into a scramble on the streets. And you mentioned a really important thing about the transition to heroin. It's really important people understand this. This is a direct result of the drug war. Best way to explain it is through something called the Iron Law of Prohibition. Really simple. Day before alcohol was banned in America, the most popular drink by far was beer. The day after alcohol prohibition was after prohibition ends, the most popular drink was beer. In between, you couldn't get beer anywhere. The most popular drinks were whiskey and moonshine. And the reason is this really simple thing, the Iron Law of Prohibition. Imagine if you and me had to smuggle enough alcohol. I don't know if there's a bar on this block, but imagine there is. We had to smuggle all the alcohol for that bar on that block across the United States in a wagon. If our wagon is full of beer, we're only going to be able to get the drink to 100 people. Mm-hmm. If our wagon is full of whiskey, we're going to be able to get it to 1,000 people. This happens, you can see it's a really interesting example of this. Go to any college ball game. We all know college students like drinking beer. A college ball game, they're not allowed alcohol in. What do they drink? They smuggle in whiskey. It's that effect, right? Exactly the same thing happens with other drugs. Most oxy addicts want to carry on using oxy. They can't get it on the streets. Mm-hmm. You can't buy it. It's unbelievably expensive. Right. It's basically out of the rich one. So what do? They go for the cheaper product. Just like people wanted beer, but they couldn't, so they drank whiskey. In the same way, the current situation is driving oxy addicts towards heroin precisely because of the dynamic of banning it. Mm-hmm. That's a disaster.
The war on drugs, and again, the book takes us on a journey. You went on a journey. And really takes us back in time. The center of the war on drugs was a man named Harry Anslinger. Talk a bit about him and how he created the modern notion of the war on drugs.
Harry Anslinger is such a fascinating man. I think he's the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. Huge numbers of people listening to the show will have had their lives shaped by him in all sorts of ways. Harry Anslinger was a government bureaucrat who takes over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition is ending. So he's got this huge government department with nothing to do. And he fixates on drugs and popularizes a lot of the ideas that persist today with drugs. The way I come into his story in the book, and a story that really shocked me from tracking down lots of people interviewing them, is the story of how he stalked and played a role in killing Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer.
That was fascinating.
Yeah, in 1939, Billie Holiday stands on stage not far from where we are now, and she sings the song Strange Fruit, an anti-lynching song. And her goddaughter, Lorraine Feathers, said to me, you've got to understand how shocking this was. This is a woman who wasn't even allowed to walk through the front door of the hotel because she was African-American. She had to go through the service elevator, standing in front of a mostly white audience and singing a song against lynching. And that night, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics tell her to stop singing that song. Anslinger was really driven by two things: an intense hatred of addicts and an intense hatred of African Americans. This is a man who was regarded as a crazy racist in the 1930s. Like, he used the N-word in official memos so that his senator called for him to have to resign. And Billie Holiday was the symbol of everything he hated. It was an African American woman standing up to white supremacy and a drug addict. She refused to stop singing her song. She basically said, screw you, I'm an American citizen, I'll say what I want. She'd grown up in Baltimore when it was segregated. She promised herself she was never going to bow her head to any white man. And that's when the process of stalking her began. And it's a really heartbreaking story. The first guy who was sent to stalk her was an agent called Jimmy Fletcher. Anslinger hated employing African Americans, but you couldn't really send a white guy into Harlem to stalk Billie Holiday. So he employs an African American. And this guy follows her for 2 years, dances with her, follows her everywhere. And he fell in love with her because she was so amazing. And his whole life, Jimmy Fletcher felt ashamed of what he did. He busts her. She's sent to prison. She said about the trial, it was called the United States versus Billie Holiday, and that's how it felt. And when she gets out, she's not allowed to perform anywhere. You needed a license to perform. And obviously she couldn't get one. But still Anslinger's not finished with her. He hounds her. One day she collapses in her early 40s. She's taken to hospital. She's got liver cancer. She says to one of her friends about the narcotics agents, they're going to kill me in there. Don't let them. They're going to kill me in there. On her deathbed, they handcuff her to the deathbed. I interviewed the last surviving person who was in that room. They handcuff her to the deathbed. They don't let her friends in to see her. She goes into withdrawal. One of her friends manages to get her prescribed methadone. She starts to recover a little bit. They cut off the methadone and she dies. But here's the thing that really inspired me and helped me to think about the addicts in my life. Billie Holiday never stopped singing that song. She always found somewhere to sing it. She went anywhere they would have her and she sang that song. And it really helped me to think about the heroism of addicts and the incredible courage of addicts, something I saw all over the world, that there's partly the heroism of continuing when you're in terrible pain, and Billie Holiday was in terrible pain. She was raped as a child. She found it very hard to deal with life, but she was fiercely strong. Her friend Annie Ross said to me, Billie Holiday wasn't weak. She was as strong as she could be.
You write in chapter 2 about the Williams brothers, really, again, at the beginning of the drug war, they saw a century ahead what this policy would mean for all of us.
It's kind of mind-blowing, actually. They were doctors in California, and we forget this now, but for a long time, drugs were legal. And they were doctors at a time when drugs were legal. So what would happen is you would go to your local pharmacy and you would buy your drugs. And the most popular ways of consuming them were very mild forms of the drug, for the reason we were discussing earlier, the Iron Law of Prohibition. Most popular way of consuming opiates wasn't heroin. Heroin was virtually unheard of. It was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which was a syrup you would drink. You could buy cocaine-based teas, cocaine-based drinks. Coca-Cola really did contain extracts of coca, and so on. And what they saw is that when drugs were banned, suddenly everything changes. It's transferred from people like them, doctors and pharmacists, to armed criminal gangs. Those armed criminal gangs screw up the product. They charge 1,000% more. They suddenly create this whole wave of crime because you have the gangs warring against each other, because that's what happens when you ban things, because they can't go to the cops. But also, the addicts suddenly change. Before it was illegal, of course, addiction was always a tragedy, but the vast majority of addicts had jobs, they had lives, they were no more likely to be poor than anyone else, according to the official study. Suddenly, the women are prostituting themselves, the men are robbing in order to pay this grossly inflated price to gangsters. And it's incredible. Henry Smith Williams writes a book in the early 1930s called Drug Addicts Are Human Beings, where he says, we would never do this because it would be foolish, but if we were to continue with this policy for another 50 years, there'll be a $5 billion smuggling industry in the United States. He was right to almost the exact year. And Harry Anslinger has him destroyed. He has his brother stripped of his license.
He didn't think we would continue.
He thought it was inconceivable that we would continue. There was a huge war against doctors. People forget this. The war on drugs was incredibly contested when it was introduced. It did not come in lightly. Harry Anslinger has to prosecute 17,000 doctors who carry on prescribing to addicts when he tries to ban them. And one of the things that really blew my mind, actually, is they shut it down. There was a loophole in the law when drugs were first banned, saying doctors can do what they want. They can prescribe to addicts. And that was shut down state by state. And the story, as far as I can tell, untold until now, apart from at the time, is the story of why they were shut down in California. It turns out the local Chinese drug gangs were really annoyed that in Nevada, drug addicts had to go to them to buy their drugs, but in California, they could go to the doctors. So the local Chinese drug gangs bribed the cops to enforce the drug war, to introduce the drug war, because it worked so well for them, because then suddenly everyone had to go to them. The only people who have ever won in the drug war are armed criminal gangs. They paid for it to come in at the start. They are fighting to keep it at the end.
Absolutely. You mentioned it earlier while working on the book, and you traveled all over the world. You talked to people affected by the war on drugs, and one of them was Chino Harden. Tell us about Chino's life and what it reveals about the disastrous effects of the drug war.
Yeah, Chino is one of the most extraordinary people I know. Chino was conceived in 1980 when his mother, who was a crack addict in Brownsville, Brooklyn, was raped by his father, who was an NYPD officer. Chino was a child of the drug war in the truest sense, one of the most articulate people I've ever met. Chino's mother dies in the first wave of the AIDS epidemic because not only was nothing done to stop the spread of AIDS among addicts, in fact, the things that would have prevented it, like distributing clean needles, were criminalised because they were under the drug paraphernalia laws. So Chino's mother dies. Soon after, Chino, at the age of 13, start selling crack on his corner in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And although Chino is a very empathetic person, Chino explained to me really well about the dynamics of how drug gangs have to work when things are banned. If you and me go to the local liquor store and we try to just take a load of the beer, they'll call the cops and take us away, right? They don't have to be violent. They don't have to be intimidating. That's just how it works. If we go up to the local weed or coke dealer and we try to take their things, obviously they can't ring the police. They have to fight us. But ideally, you don't want to be having fights all the time. You want to establish a reputation for being such a terrifying person that no one will dare to screw with you. And Chino quickly learned that to run this gang that he was running, that's what he had to do. He had to be terrifying. He had to be violent. He had to commit theatrical acts of aggression in order that no one would screw with him. There's a sociologist who calls this a culture of terror. It's what prohibition creates. So Chino rises through the Crips, becomes very successful, is in and out of prison, first goes to this horrendous child prison called Sparford, then Rikers Island. To send Chino and his gang of 4 other people to prison for a year cost $1 million. I don't know if there's anyone listening to this who can think of something better we could do with $1 million in Brownsville, Brooklyn than send 5 kids to be in stone cells. But what's amazing to me about Chino is Chino eventually gets out of prison in his early 20s, learns loads about the drug war, and just discovers, oh, none of this had to happen. His mother's life, there are places where they treat addicts with compassion. A lot of them recover. There are places where they stopped addicts from getting HIV. Chino's life as a dealer, none of that had to happen. Chino became this incredible campaigner against the drug war and actually led the campaign to shut down the youth prison that he was put in, Sparford, and succeeded. That youth prison no longer exists because of what Chino did.
Wow. The book is Chasing the Scream, the First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. Johann Hari is my guest and the author of Michelangelo Signorile on Sirius XM Progress 127. Talk about some of the other people you met. You had mentioned earlier in Brooklyn as well.
So I met people all over the United States. I mean, one person who really comes to mind is an amazing woman called Lee Maddox. Lee was a really, I think of her as Harry Anslinger's dream girl. She was a completely passionate drug warrior. She signed up to the cops because her best friend was killed by what she believed was a drug gang. And she went into this to destroy drug gangs, and she waged a merciless war. But Lee is a really honest person, and Lee noticed something. If you're a cop and you arrest a rapist, the next week there's less rape in your town. If you arrest a drug dealer, A, there's someone else on the corner the next morning, no one doubts that. But B, what she noticed is that violence actually goes up. The rate of killing actually goes up if you arrest dealers. She didn't understand why, and then she realised what you do is you trigger a turf war. If you think about Chino established control of his patch. If someone came along and killed or arrested Chino, you just get rival gangs fighting it out. Lots of people get killed in the crossfire. That led Lee to believe, not that we should just tolerate drug dealing, but that we should bankrupt it. We should really make the decision that actually means that you end it, and that's transferring it to a regulated legal sector.
You write about the process in societies of decriminalizing drugs. Of course, we've had now, just in the past couple of years, 2 states that have legalized marijuana. You write about how 14 years ago, Portugal decriminalized all drugs. Talk a little bit about what happened there, what led to the transformation, the way the reforms have worked in practice.
Well, the first thing I'm going to say to everyone, and this really helped me, is none of this argument is abstract, right? If we were having this conversation 20 years ago, you'd be saying, well, maybe if you try decriminalization, this will happen, that will happen. We don't need to speculate anymore. There are lots of countries that have moved beyond the war on drugs. And I went to them because I wanted to see how it works in practice. And if I'm totally honest, I actually put it off until quite late in the process because I thought, my God, what if I go there and that doesn't work either? What the most depressing book ever written apart from everything else. But actually, it was kind of amazing what happened. So 15 years ago now, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is huge. And every year they tried the American way more intensely. They arrested more people, they put more people in prison, and every year the problem got worse. And one day the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they said, look, let's set up a panel of scientists and judges to figure out what we should actually do. And let's agree in advance that we'll do whatever they tell us to do. So it just took it out of politics. I don't think they thought they'd come back and recommend what they did, but, to their credit, they stuck by it. And the panel came back and said, decriminalise everything, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial second step, take all the money that used to be spent on arresting drug users, trying drug users, imprisoning drug users, take all that money and apply the lessons of Rat Park use that money to help addicts to reconnect to society. So partly that's things like rehab and psychological support, but much more importantly, it's making sure that every addict in Portugal has a purpose and a reason to get out of bed in the morning. What you and me, right? Forget the drug laws. You and me could be drunk now if we wanted to be. We could be sitting here drinking vodka, right? Anyone listening to this could be drunk. They're almost certainly not. Why not? Because we've got something in our life we want to be present for. We've got jobs we love, we've got friends we love, we've got people in our lives we love. And what João Goulão, the incredible man who led the Portuguese decriminalisation, believed was you want to make sure that every addict has that. So one of the key planks was just subsidised jobs. Say you used to be a mechanic, your life fell apart, you got a smack addiction. They'll go to a garage, and once the guy is ready, they'll say, if you employ him for a year, we'll pay half his wages. Yeah, something simple like that. Micro loans for addicts to help businesses. It's the exact opposite of what we do. I went in Arizona out with a chain gang of women who were forced to go out, wearing T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and dig graves and be degraded in all sorts of ways. Those women will, when they get out of prison, never be able to get a job because they've got a criminal record in the legal economy anyway, or it's very unlikely. Portugal is the exact opposite of that model. And, it's been 14 years, we've got the results. Injecting drug use is down by 50%, 50%. Every study shows overall addiction is down. And actually one of the most moving interviews I did was with a guy called João Figueira, who is the chief drug cop and was led the opposition to this decriminalisation. And he said, not unreasonably, he said a lot of the things that a lot of your listeners will be thinking, which is, surely if you decriminalise all drugs, drug use will massively go up. There'll be all sorts of disasters. And what he said to me, the exact quote is in the book, but he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked about how he was ashamed that he'd spent 20 years arresting and harassing drug users and that it was a complete waste of time. And he hoped the whole world followed Portugal's example. There's virtually nobody in Portugal who wants to go back. If you look at the countries that have moved beyond the drug war, they never regret it. It's like alcohol prohibition. We forget this now, but alcohol prohibition was a huge movement in the United States. The minute it was over, have you ever heard anyone advocate alcohol prohibition? I mean, we just wouldn't do it. It's one of those things where once it's gone and you pursue the compassionate alternatives and you use the money wisely instead of foolishly, people don't want to go back.
And yet we do have a lot of people who have a problem with alcohol.
Absolutely.
How does the research showing perhaps a genetic propensity to alcoholism or drug abuse fit into what you're talking about?
I think I talk about the work of Dr. Gabor Mate, who we mentioned earlier, who works with hardcore addicts in Vancouver. And I think part of this question is about, it's true that the children of addicts are much more likely to be addicts. The best evidence is that most of that, not all, is determined not by the genes, but by childhood trauma. There's an amazing study of this called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which people should look up, which basically found that for every traumatic event that happens to a child, they're 2 to 4 times more likely to grow up to be an injecting drug addict. There's a stronger correlation between childhood trauma and adult addiction than there is between obesity and diabetes. And that's partly because it relates to Rat Park as well. If you have a very traumatic childhood, it's much harder to trust the world. It's much harder to make ordinary connections. You're afraid. You don't have that baseline on which most of us rest. And you're much more likely to be isolated and alone and afraid as an adult. Not to say that, of course, some people can overcome childhood trauma and they need to be loved and supported. But so I think it's more a subset of that. And Gabor is a really fascinating example because Gabor lived through it. Gabor was smuggled out of the Budapest ghetto as a baby in the middle of the Holocaust. His mother, they were Jewish. His mother just handed him to a Christian stranger and said, "Please take my child." And when Gabor grew up, obviously became a very successful doctor, he found himself having these uncontrollable compulsions. Now, for him, they were obsessively buying CDs, which may not sound so bad and clearly isn't as bad as a crack addiction. But, he would abandon women in labour, run out and buy a load of CDs. We're talking about a pretty serious addiction. And that's partly what led Gabor on this journey to understand the role of childhood trauma and addiction. And I think childhood trauma and isolation are very closely related. The way Gabor explains it is, when you're a baby, you internalise the way your mother or caregiver treats you. So if when you're upset, your mother reassures you, calms you down, as you grow older, when you're upset, you'll reassure yourself and calm yourself down. If when you're upset, you're responded to with anger and hostility, you will regard your own anger, your own upset with anger and hostility, and you'll be a lot more likely as an adult to need to be soothed externally by things like alcohol.
We just have literally a minute.
Okay.
But you'd written a piece in Huffington Post about Philip Seymour Hoffman, saying that if we had not pursued this war on drugs, he and countless other addicts would be alive today.
It would be significantly more likely he would be alive today. And there's very strong evidence for that. I've been to the countries where they treat addicts with compassion, where they do everything they can to help them, where they distribute clean needles, where they provide them with a safe legal supply rather than the filthy, contaminated supply that Philip Seymour Hoffman was being given by armed criminal gangs. And a lot fewer addicts die there, and a lot more of them live, and a lot more of them get clean. We've got to look at the evidence. One thing you can say about the war on drugs, to be fair to it, we gave it a fair shot. We've given it 100 years. No one can say we didn't do our best. And we couldn't even keep the drugs out of prisons. And we've got a walled perimeter and guards manning it 24 hours. That gives you some sense of how well we're ever going to be able to make this strategy work.
Mm-hmm. And of course, how it's played out racially, and it's a disaster.
Yeah, 17% of drug dealers are African American, and they make up 65% of the people who go to prison for it. Tells you something. The same time he found out Billie Holiday was a junkie, Harry Anslinger found out Judy Garland was a junkie. He advised her to take longer vacations and told the studio she was going to be fine. Spot the difference.
Really just great work and just so much for us to think about. Thank you so much for coming
Thank you for having me and for reading the book so carefully. I really appreciate it.
The book, again, Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs. Johann Hari. Also, you can read his work, I just mentioned, on Huffington Post.
The Michelangelo Signorile Show on Sirius XM.